Monster Hunter Wilds starts strong. By immersing you in the Forbidden Lands, you take on massive monsters in a vibrant world that feels both alive and ever-changing. And as such, I enjoyed my time with the story, learning about the lore and fighting a wide variety of monsters. However, the endgame did little to motivate me to keep grinding, or even continue playing. With Wilds, Capcom is seeking to open the series to a new audience. And in a lot of ways, they're successful. I haven't played Monster Hunter World or Monster Hunter Rise, but I found it pretty easy to get into Wilds. For most of my early game experience, I rolled with the dual blades, but later I found the sword and shield to be more comfortable, as you could actually use your consumables without your weapon getting automatically sheathed and then having to go through a long, awkward process of redrawing it, re-entering focus mode, etc., etc. But as much as I liked the early game, my enjoyment actually went down the more I played. With the base game's low difficulty, the first time I fought a monster was the most exciting, because later, most of my hunts just felt like a foregone conclusion. So I often felt like I was fighting with the game's control scheme, rather than fighting against the monster that was on my screen. Monster Hunter Wilds absolutely has some great high points, but ultimately I came away from the game feeling rather disappointed. And as such, I'm neither going to recommend it, nor recommend against it. So if you're watching this review to make up your mind on buying the game or not, I recommend looking at least one other review afterwards to get a more balanced perspective. But for now, I'm going to get into my thoughts on Monster Hunter Wilds after playing the game for 60 hours and completing all of the base game content. It took me about 20 hours to play through the core story for Monster Hunter Wilds. This is a guided, on-the-rails experience that functions primarily to introduce you to the setting, the world, and many, many monsters. Now again, I don't know too much about Monster Hunter as a franchise, and when I first played the demo for Wilds, I found it to be very overwhelming, because I was dropped into the world without much context and told, go kill monsters. There are icons everywhere. I didn't know the importance of killing one monster over another. All I really knew is that certain monsters hit really hard and others were easier to manage. And so I very much appreciated the more cinematic approach to world building and storytelling in the early parts of Monster Hunter Wild. Each time you enter a locale, you meet the people who live there, and you work with them to solve problems, and, well, every problem starts looking like a dead monster if your only tool is a hunter. But I also really enjoyed the focus on learning about the environments and keeping things in balance. There were a couple times where, yes, the story being so on the rails did chafe with me a bit, especially when it rushed me off to find a new monster before I got a food buff, which resulted in me being carded. But overall, I'd say this is the best part of the game, or at the very least, the part of the game that resonated with me the most. The story is at its best when it puts the monsters front and center, giving each of them their own epic introduction. The Dashagama, for example, is a major focus in the early parts of the story, and it has an introductory cutscene equal to any major boss in another game. Demigods in Elden Ring? No, move over, the Dashagama's here. Seeing it get attacked by the Balahara, pulled beneath the sand, only to rise again, just reinforced how much of a threat this creature poses, and that made defeating it all the more meaningful. Then for each region's apex predator, there's a bit of drama thrown into the introduction, because when you encounter the apex predator of the second locale, Uthduna, it's during a massive downpour, with both your team and Olivia's being put on the back foot, because the creature has an advantage, it's on its home turf, and you're slipping and sliding everywhere while hoping to drive it back. This dramatic weather very much helps to set the scene and reinforce that these monsters are an extension of the forces of nature. They change the world around them, and the world around them changes with them. Now with that said, there was some ludonarrative dissonance between how the game presents hunting during the story and later on in the endgame, because during the story you're always waiting on permission, where before the hunter engages with anything, Alma says, through the authority of the guild, I authorize you to hunt this monster. And yeah, a lot of the time I was sitting there going, come on. I just want to go full murder hobo on that thing. It has valuable materials and I can use it to craft a weapon or a hat. But in the endgame, pretty much all you're doing is going full murder hobo on monsters and using them to craft weapons and hats. That narrative thread, that restraint, is gone. And I'm not sure where it got off to. But the story in Monster Hunter Wilds is not all about high-intensity action. There are a lot of wholesome moments, such as after rescuing Isai and his sister, you get to eat a meal with his family. There's a lot of pretty interesting characters as well, such as Rogue the Wubwub and the Wubwubs in general, which, after meeting them, I genuinely felt sorry for one of the monsters. I mean, yeah, okay, it did try to kill them, but let's be honest. If you woke me up by pulling out chunks of my hair, I'd probably try to kill you too, or at the very least, I'd be thinking about it. I do think a lot of the characterization moments were the weaker parts of a story, because most of the characters didn't undergo very much character growth. Yeah, there's a pretty wide range of characters, and most of them are generally enjoyable to be around. But the only one who changes over the course of a story is Nata. Initially, he's driven by vengeance. His village was destroyed by an unknown monster, and he wants to destroy that monster. But as he learns more about it, he develops a connection with it. He starts to see it as something more than a mindless force of destruction. And then by the end, his perspective changes again, as he grows maybe a little older and definitely a little wiser. But beyond Nata, I feel like all the other characters can basically just be broken down to their gameplay function. So Olivia is the other competent hunter who's there to support you. Alma is there to give you permission to kill the monsters, and Gemma is there to craft your weapons and armor. For most of these characters, there's really not much else to their personalities. And in that sense, it almost felt like the Forbidden Lands and the monsters themselves were the main characters of the story. Which, to be honest with you, I didn't really mind. With a franchise being called Monster Hunter, of course, the monsters are front and center, both throughout the story and in the endgame. And Capcom put an incredible level of care and attention to detail into each creature's design. For example, the Dashagama is a giant lion. It has powerful attacks which do massive damage, but it's slow and easily dodged, making it a very easy encounter even if you're under-geared. On the other hand, the spidery Lalabarina doesn't hit all that hard, but combine its rapid movement with paralytic florets, and you might end up taking way more damage than you expect, especially if you're playing a high-flying, very mobile thing like the Dual Blades, and you use a wound break and immediately fly your way into paralysis. And out of all the monsters that I faced throughout my time in Monster Hunter Wilds, it's Gore Magala that presented me with the greatest challenge. This is the monster where I truly struggled. The monster that was almost a shiny beacon of a challenge that I suspect this game is going to have in the future, after title updates and, more importantly, after the DLC. Because Gore Magala is extremely aggressive, and it uses a frenzy of attacks meant to overwhelm your defenses. So you dodged a tail swipe. That claw's coming for you. Oh, you dodged it. Okay, well now it's using its wing arm to try to strike you. And oh, you moved a little bit too far away. Now you're going to have to deal with its multi-fireball breath attack. And if you avoid all that, watch out. The big one's coming next, and if you make a couple mistakes, you're getting carded. And so fighting this monstrosity for the first time was a ton of fun. And how you approach each monster also depends on the weapon you use, because different monsters have different parts of their body that are vulnerable to damage. In general, I found that heads, front legs, and tails tend to be better targets, both because they stick out and because they tend to be weaknesses. With blows against a monster's core body, and quite often their rear legs, being less effective. But that said, there are exceptions. Some monsters do have weak rear legs, and for some monsters you don't actually want to be anywhere near their tail. So I found the first time fighting a monster to be the most exciting. This is where I felt like I was figuring out a puzzle by chipping away at the massive monstrosity. Then you have the apex predators, the baddest monsters in each region. These fights take place during a storm, when the monster is at the height of its power, and each has their own unique mechanics. Rei Dao, for example, is a railgun dragon. And yeah, if you thought Laser Shark was cool, Railgun Dragon totally beats Laser Shark. Uthduna cloaks itself in water to deflect your blows, making it really, really annoying to fight actually. And New Udra is an oily octopus-like creature that lights itself aflame, since it has lots of wiggly tentacles, well, all the more tentacles to chop off with your big, oversized tentacle chopper. Then you have Jindahad, whose icy breaths are very difficult to avoid, and it actually has a unique mechanic, because when fighting Jindahad, you don't just need to worry about its slams, its swipes, its breath attacks. You also need to worry about knocking it down to strike at its main weakness, the spines along its back. These are only vulnerable if you're able to do enough damage to its head or one of its legs or its tail to actually knock the creature over. And occasionally it unleashes devastating, lethal explosions of fire and ice. So you need to pull down an icy shard from the nearby terrain and hide behind it if you want to have any hope of surviving the encounter. Then, as you progress through high rank the post-story content, the fights escalate in complexity, because you can fight guardians, frenzied monsters, tempered monsters, and in some cases, multiple monsters at once. Guardians, for example, draw upon the energy of Wyveria to recharge their powers. Tempered monsters are badasses that have gained endless amounts of experience from hundreds of clashes with previous denizens, and frenzied monsters attack almost relentlessly until you slay them or you yourself succumb. And then, of course, you have the game's flagship monster, Arkveld, a dragon whose chain-like appendages can be used to lash out, protect itself, or just deal a lot of damage over a massive area. Though personally, I found Arkveld to be relatively easy because at that point I was playing Sword and Shield, so I was able to block most of its attacks, and in fact I struggled a bit more against Gore Magala, the monster that you fight just before Arkveld. So when it comes to hunting monsters in wilds, the fights are spectacular. And even within a type of monster, the fights themselves are often very different. If I'm confronting a Rathalos, that's going to be a very different approach and strategy from my end than if I'm fighting, say, Arkveld, even if both of them are Wyvern or Dragon types. And I certainly won't be fighting a spidery Nursilla the same way I'd be fighting a Lalabarina. I also think this is why I enjoyed the low rank experience more than the high rank experience, because in low rank, every single encounter is new. There's very little grinding. Whereas in high rank, the game only introduces about a half dozen more monsters, and some of the monsters introduced are basically copies. Whenever the game introduced a new fight to me, I found that compelling. But when the game told me, now go grind on fights you already know, that just wasn't as engaging for me. There are 14 different weapons you can use in Monster Hunter Wilds. You have one actively, and then can use a second weapon which you switch to by mounting the Sacred. This gives you quite a lot of flexibility to bring different elements to a fight, or bring two different weapons to handle various situations, such as one to break a monster's armor, then another to do a lot of damage when it's vulnerable. Now personally, I spent most of my time on the dual blades and the sword and shield. The dual blades are all about speed and aggression. You're going into demon mode, you're chopping at everything, and unfortunately your combos are pretty easy to disrupt. So if a monster roars, if a monster hits you, if you dodge at the right time, all of these things can disrupt the combo, making the dual blades a bit finicky to play. But man, is it fun when they click, because you're able to absolutely burn through the monster's health. The sword and shield is a little bit more of a balanced weapon. It's still quite fast and agile, but you have a lot of flexibility here, because you can use a lot of slashing and chopping strikes with your sword, or you can just stand in front of a monster and shield bash it into the face until it gets concussed and passes out. Yes, that is an actual mechanic. In addition to this, the sword also has quite a lot of flexibility for the wound breaks. You can either do a downswing that deals quite a bit of damage, or an upswing that can be comboed into a second attack, provided the monster doesn't fall away or dodge. And of course, because you have a shield, you can block stuff. If you have the right decorations, you're able to block everything and stand in even the deadliest of attacks. Also, it might have taught me some bad habits. Though in addition to those weapons, I did spend a bit of time trying some other things. For example, the hammer that deals a lot of powerful blows. It's pretty easy to use, at least to a decent level, and it's very good at concussing monsters or shattering hard parts. But it's also a little bit slow. The greatsword, on the other hand, is extremely slow, made slower by the fact that you use charged attacks. But it's capable of using offsets, basically parrying a monster mid-attack, and block. So, if you time everything correctly, it is extremely rewarding to play. Unfortunately, I'm also pretty bad at using the greatsword, so I found it equal parts rewarding and frustrating. Last up a bow, This one kind of feels like easy mode, actually, where you're able to sit back, especially in multiplayer, like 3-4 player groups, both super easy to play. You just stand back, you put a tracer on a weak point of a monster, and then you fire over and over until that weak point becomes a wound. You pop the wound with your focus strike and immediately unleash a Dragon Piercer. This does absolutely massive bursts of damage, especially on longer monsters if you're able to aim it down the monster's body so that it pierces through multiple segments. And so ultimately, my favorite weapon was the sword and shield, because I felt like I had a tool for pretty much every situation. And, better yet, when you're using the sword and shield, if you need to drink a potion, your weapon doesn't get sheathed. And I don't know if this is just a me thing or something that drives veterans crazy too, but having my weapon get sheathed in combat drove me crazy. Like, sure, I get it, you can't use your hands to hold weapons and also drink a potion. But almost every other video game protagonist has figured out that if there's a giant enemy standing in front of you trying to fucking murder you, you pull your weapons out after you finish drinking the goddamn potion. Luckily, you can just play Sword and Shield and this isn't an issue. Now, in my experience, the most rewarding portion of Monster Hunter Wilds gameplay revolves around Focus Mode, which I've been told is a new addition to the franchise, where you freely aim your attacks to hit monster weak points. You can also use Focus Strike to break wounds, again gaining materials, dealing massive damage, and often knocking the monster down, which leads to an exciting minigame within each fight, where you want to aim for the monster's weak points, you want to hit them repeatedly to open up wounds, and then use your attacks or your focus strikes to break those wounds to maximize your burst damage, knocking the monster down so that you have time to hit it to open up more wounds, repeating the process. And you do this by executing a variety of weapon combos. So, for example, you might go B, 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 Y, B, Y, B to use a powerful chopping attack on the sword and shield. And precisely executing these combos does a lot more damage, but for most weapons, especially in the early game, and honestly even all the way through high rank, my experience was that I could mash my buttons and it's more or less good enough to get the job done. Now in theory, this system should be fun. I actually find that games with button-based combos, such as Tales of Symphonia, stand out to me in comparison to games that don't use button-based combos. But the controls for Monster Hunter Wilds drove me crazy. There are so many weapons that rely on the YB button combo, which is a problem because playing normally, I use the same finger to press both Y and B by right thumb. So if I'm trying to hit YB, sometimes I will hit Y by mistake. Sometimes I will hit B by mistake because part of my thumb hits that button registering the input instead of a YB. I also found that sometimes the monsters can very easily disrupt your combos. So for example, on the dual blades, you can go right trigger to go into demon mode, Y, your basic attack combo to build up meter, YB to start your damage combo, RT, RT, RT. This is the demon flurry that does a ton of hits, massive damage, really fun. But what if I do RT, Y, I try to hit YB, but I hit YB instead. Well now, right trigger takes me out of demon mode. Well now I have to use right trigger to go back into demon mode to try to YB again, and if I make the same mistake, well, then I have to repeat the process, all the while the monster is trying to kill me. On top of this, there are a ton of different radials and consumables. And I didn't need to use most of them frequently, but I needed to use them. So it was a perpetual frustration of, which menu was this in? God damn it, I'm in the wrong radial menu. Oh no, I just got hit because I was using an item because I was in the wrong radial menu. Alright, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk on why the controls in Monster Hunter Wild drive me up a wall. Let's get back to the regularly scheduled programming, talking more details about the game's weapon and armor system. So how do you make these weapons? Well, you craft them with monster parts. So if you want to paralyze monsters, maybe look for a monster that has paralytic abilities, like the Lalabarana, and craft a weapon from its weapon line. You start with a basic version, and then as you progress through the ranks and as you hunt more dangerous monsters, you'll unlock better versions of that weapon. Each weapon's appearance and effects mirror the monster it's made from, which again, really nice attention to detail. Also, if you want to craft your weapons faster, focus on breaking wounds to get more monster parts. You also use those monster parts to make armor sets. Unlike weapons, armor sets don't have a progression tree. Instead, in low rank, each monster has one set, and in high rank it has two sets. The alpha set, which has slightly better base skills, and the beta set, which has decoration slots, meaning it's generally better because you can customize it more. There are some exceptions though. Now, when the game's progression systems revolved around Hunting a monster and using that monster to craft its weapon or armor, I enjoyed these systems. But in the very late game, it becomes more about enhancing your existing gear. You'll have everything quite quickly. The grind is about getting enough weapon enhancement materials for your Artian weapons and enough armor spheres to take it up to the higher rank. And personally, that got very boring to me, because at that point my gear wasn't changing, it was just about making the numbers on my items slightly larger. Now, the endgame for Monster Hunter Wilds didn't grab me. I enjoyed the first 20 hours as I played through low rank. I followed the cinematic story, where each mission introduced me to a new monster and built up context for the world. But once I entered high rank, I started to notice the grind. Because there's a point where you've unlocked all the monsters, and then the game starts to focus more on the Artian weapon system, and enhancing your weapon and your armors for slightly increased stats. So, by fighting tempered monsters, you gain random Artian weapon parts, and you combine 3 parts to make your own custom weapon. Cool in theory, but in practice, then you just fight more monsters to grind more materials, to make more Artian weapons, to enhance your Artian weapons and enhance your armor sets. Except you've already killed all the monsters, and these Artian weapons all look the same, so they're not nearly as interesting as the weapons you were making earlier. I also found that as I got rank 7 and rank 8 gear, the fights became easier. I did all of the content available, including Tempered Arcveld, with a mix of rank 6 and 7. So when I started equipping rank 8, instead of facing a new series of challenges, instead of the game finally getting hard, now it was about killing the monster faster, making the numbers go up. And don't get me wrong, that can be perfectly fun. There is absolutely an audience for that, and in some games, that audience is me. But here, what I was really hoping for was a challenge, or at the very least, more story. So, when it came to reaching high rank, and especially when it came to the later parts of high rank, it felt like the expectation was that players are going to keep killing the monsters because they're playing Monster Hunter. Because if you're enjoying the thrill of a hunt, you don't really need a reason why. But for me personally, the first hunt was always the most fun, and after that, as I learned more about the monster, it got less interesting. I know this is probably a contentious point, and I know that this really does mean that Monster Hunter just isn't for me. That's totally fine. If you go, no, high rank is when the game started and I loved it, awesome. Please do not let my experiences take away from that in any way. But there's one more topic that I want to talk about before getting into the verdict. An elephant in the room, if you will. Because this, more so than anything else, has dominated the discussion around the release of Monster Hunter Wilds, and that is performance issues. Now, personally, I've been quite lucky. Playing on a 3080 with an i7-12700K, I have not encountered very many issues. I played at whatever the settings the game defaulted to, the graphics looked fine. At the very least, I don't notice the frame drops, though I'm not super sensitive to this, so as long as it's able to run a stable 60, I'm not really going to be able to tell you what it's running at. But at the same time, I have the luxury of playing on a high-end system, and for a lot of people that isn't the case. In fact, when Monster Hunter World launched, I had a 1060, and as a result of the performance issues at the time, I stayed away from the game entirely. And it's always a shame to see a game release with the just go now and fix later mentality. But based on the 1.3 million players who logged in and the over 8 million copies that have sold, I guess it's working. In terms of bugs and glitches, there are a couple things that I want to mention. First of all, against Guardian Rathalos, the boss likes to just stop fighting. This happened to me not once, but twice. It is the only monster that has bugged out like this, and it's kind of amusing the first time and not particularly fun the second. Also, sometimes when joining random SOS flares, I get random error messages. I don't really know what's up with that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But honestly, in terms of my own experiences, performance, graphics, bugs, all my complaints are really minor, and I suspect, based on how well Monster Hunter World turned out, these issues are going to be fixed in the future, and Capcom's even working on fixes for them as we speak. So what's the verdict? Well, since I've said several times now, Monster Hunter Wilds isn't for me. And so I strongly recommend you look at least one other review in addition to this before deciding for or against the game. But at the same time, I wanted to give my thoughts, because not every game is going to be for everyone. And even though the game as a whole isn't for me, there are definitely parts that I enjoyed. So first up, the storytelling did a very good job of establishing the tone and introducing me to the world. While the cinematic presentation probably isn't for everyone, I'm sure there's a lot of people who just wanted to rush to Endgame as soon as possible, I was happy to be along for the ride. Now, outside of Nata, none of the characters really experienced that much character growth. This didn't matter too much to me, because it felt like the game was putting the Forbidden Lands themselves, the different locales, and the monsters, front and center within its story and storytelling, which also made the story feel a little bit different from a lot of other games that are so character-driven. Then there are the wilds themselves, and it is truly rare for a video game world to feel alive. This is something that Monster Hunter Wilds absolutely succeeds at. The land is fallow, then a storm rolls in, covering everything in gray, leaving it awash with wind. At the height of a storm, an apex predator emerges. After you defeat it, the storm calms, and in that subsequent calm, the lands grow lush. And so I loved the world here. I loved interacting with it, I loved exploring it. I just wish the game gave you more reasons to immerse yourself in it, instead of just cycling through menus to start your hunts and then cycling through more menus while your sacred auto paths to start the next one. Then there are the monsters. Each one has its own strengths and weaknesses, and this is far more than just stats in a menu. They're part of a monster's body. You might need to hit one of a monster's heads to do more damage, or on another, your weapon might bounce off against the bony plates protecting its back. Even the most mundane fight against a monster in Wilds is well worth being a boss battle in any other title. And I especially love the sense of character given to each of the monsters, like how the Congalala tends to be a bit disgusting. The Lalabarina is quick and efficient, while also being quite dainty. And then there's Arkveld. Full of rage and power, it lashes out using its chain-like appendages. Next up we have the weapons and the gameplay. And in terms of weapons, I like the variety. Pretty much everything felt different. A hammer was very slow, good for bonking things, mashing B over and over. The greatsword, very fun when you pull off the counterattacks. Not so fun when the monster bodies you because you're trying to pull off a counterattack. But ultimately, the sword and shield was my favorite, just due to the speed and versatility. At the same time, I found the combat to be frustrating. It felt like my hunter was constantly sheathing his weapon, and because YB is pretty hard to hit accurately, I very often felt like I was fighting against the game's controls, more so than I was fighting against the monster on screen. And as much as I liked the game early on, I feel like my enjoyment lessened the more that I played. My first 20 hours? Excellent. The middle 20 were fine, and then by the last 20, I started to actively dislike the gameplay loop. Because I felt like I had already done everything. I had already beaten the monsters, and the only thing left for me to do was to grind more. And this is where I really started to lose interest. And yeah, I do think difficulty played a role here, because in the entire 60-hour playtime, I only failed twice, at least in single player. A couple times when I was joining an SOS flare, that also failed, but that wasn't due to me being carded, that was due to other people being carded, so I don't really count it. And sure, if the Ardian system interested me more and I actually wanted to grind up those stats, I probably would have played for longer. There's a lot to do if that interests you. It's just for me, it really didn't. And so all told, I think Monster Hunter Wilds is going to go through some growing pains between the performance issues, the low difficulty for the base game, and a lack of meaningful endgame content. But at the same time, Capcom has a good track record of supporting Monster Hunter titles. So, after a few title updates, and especially after the DLC, I think the game's going to be in a really good spot, and a lot of people are going to fall in love with it. It's just that, at the end of the day, Monster Hunter Wilds, and probably the Monster Hunter franchise as a whole, isn't really for me. So I'm going to stick to my grand strategy, city builders, Souls-likes, ARPGs, RPGs, sim games, indie games, roguelikes, all that stuff, and I'll leave the monster hunting to you. So those are my thoughts on Monster Hunter Wilds. If you want to see my thoughts on other games, then do be sure to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there. Also, if you want a fun little behind-the-scenes look at what the script for this video looked like before I actually started recording and editing and refining it, you can find that for as low as $1 a month over on my Patreon. In this case, quite a lot changed. In fact, an entire section basically got cut from the script. In fact, an entire section got cut because it could pretty much just be summed up in a couple lines in the verdict, which is, well, exactly what I ended up doing. But now I'm curious about something. If you're a Monster Hunter veteran who's already played a lot of Monster Hunter Wilds and watched this review anyway, what are your thoughts on the game? Are you having fun? Did you find it too easy? Are you looking forward to future content? Let me know all of that down below. And for everyone else, just let me know down below what you thought of a review. With that said, if you're looking for something else to watch, then check out a couple of my other reviews, will be linked up in the card and down below. For now, thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.